Namaskar friends, welcome to Facts and Figures. Let me today tell you a few things about the US presidential election, its nomination and election process. Friends, the American elections for the president will happen in November. The campaigns have already started where one might be hearing names such as Joe Biden, Bernie Sanders, Democrats, Republicans quite often on the television. There is a long drill that goes around before the President of United States is finally selected or elected, I would say. Let me briefly take you through this process. The modern nomination process of the US presidential elections consists of two major parts. First is the series of presidential primary elections and caucuses. Friends, caucuses are meetings in which local members of a political party register their preference of candidates running for the office or select delegates to attend the conventions. It is held in each state. Second is the presidential nominating conventions held by each political party. This process was never included in the constitution and has thus evolved over a period of time by the political parties to clear the field for candidates. The primary elections are run by state and local governments, while the caucuses are organized directly by the political parties. Some states hold only primary elections, some hold only caucuses, and others use a combination of both. These primaries and caucuses are staggered generally between January and June before the federal election, with Iowa and New Hampshire traditionally holding the first presidential state caucus and primary respectively. Like the general election, presidential caucuses or primaries are indirect elections. The major political parties officially vote for their presidential candidates at their respective nominating conventions, all of which are usually held in the summer before the federal election. Depending on each state's law and that state's political party's rule, when voters cast ballots for a candidate, in a presidential caucus or primary, they may be voting to award delegates bound to vote for the presidential candidate at the presidential nominating conventions, or they may simply be expressing a negative opinion that the state party is not bound to follow in selecting delegates to their respective national convention. Unlike the general election, voters in the US territories can also elect delegates to the national convention. Now friends, there are in all a total of 14 US territories, 5 of which are permanently inhabited and 9 of which are uninhabited or barely habitated, you could say. Furthermore, each political party can determine how many delegates or elected members to allocate to each state and territory. In 2012, for example, the Democratic and Republican Party conventions each used two different formulas to allocate delegates. The Democrats based theirs on two main factors: the proportion of votes each state gave to the Democratic candidate in the previous 3 presidential elections, and the number of electoral votes each state had in the electoral college. In contrast, the Republicans assigned to each state 10 delegates plus 3 delegates per congressional district. Both parties then gave a fixed number of delegates to each territory and finally bonus delegates to states and territories that passed certain criteria. Along with the delegates chosen during primaries and caucuses, the state and US territory delegations pertaining to both Democratic and Republican Party conventions also include unpledged delegates who have a vote. For Republicans, they consist of 3 top party officials from each state and territory, where Democrats have a more expansive group of unpledged delegates called superdelegates, who are party leaders and elected officials. Each party's presidential candidate also chooses a vice presidential nominee to run with him or her on the same ticket, and this choice is rubber stamped by the convention. In this context, I would recommend an interesting novel also titled Going Rogue by Sarah Palin that describes America's election campaign in great vividity. If no single candidate has secured a majority of delegates, including both pledged and unpledged, then a brokered convention results. All pledged delegates are then released and are able to switch their allegiance to a different candidate. Thereafter, the nomination is decided through a process of alternating political horse trading and additional rounds of revotes. The election conventions have historically been held inside convention centers, but since the late 20th century, both the Democratic and Republican parties have favored sports arenas and domed stadiums to accommodate the increasing attendance. To sum up, the election of the President and the Vice President of the United States is an indirect election. Friends, an indirect election is an election in which voters do not choose the candidates for an office, but elect people who then choose. It is one of the oldest forms of elections and is still used today for many presidents, cabinets, upper houses, and supranational legislatures in which citizens of the United States who are registered to vote in one of the 50 US states or in Washington, D.C., cast ballots not directly for those offices but instead for members of the Electoral College. An Electoral College is a body of electors established by the United States Constitution which forms every 4 years for the sole purpose of electing the President and the Vice President of the United States. These electors, by electors I mean a person who has the right to vote in an election, especially one for members of a national parliament, then in turn casts direct votes known as electoral votes for the president and for the vice president. The candidate who receives an absolute majority of electoral votes, at least 270 out of a total of 538, since the 23rd Amendment granted voting rights to the citizens of DC, is then elected to that office. If no candidate receives an absolute majority of the votes for president, the House of Representatives choose the winner. If no one receives an absolute majority of the votes for vice president, then the Senate chooses the winner. So friends, in nutshell, the election of the president and the vice president of the United States is an indirect vote in which citizens cast ballots for a set members of the US Electoral College. These electors then cast direct votes for the president and the vice president. If both votes result in an absolute majority, the election is over. So friends, it's a little complicated. It's not as simple as India, but yet it's a very old system that they've been following. So that's all for today, friends. Goodbye and see you next week.